Welcome to Part 2 of Session A. You've already learned about the Supremacy Clause and the constitutional hierarchy it creates. Now we're going to deepen that understanding significantly. We're going to explore how this hierarchy actually works in practice, why the founders created it the way they did, and most importantly, how you can use it to analyze government authority claims. This session will give you analytical tools that most law students never fully master. By the end, you'll understand not just what the Supremacy Clause says, but how to apply it to real-world situations. This is where constitutional literacy begins to transform into constitutional competency. Before we dive deeper into the Supremacy Clause itself, let's understand the specific historical problem it was designed to solve. From 1781 to 1789, America operated under the Articles of Confederation. This system had a critical structural flaw: there was no clear hierarchy between federal and state authority. When federal and state governments claimed conflicting powers, there was no constitutional mechanism to resolve the dispute. The result? Complete chaos. States ignored federal treaties with foreign nations. States imposed conflicting trade regulations that made interstate commerce nearly impossible. States essentially operated as independent countries that happened to share a loose alliance. Foreign nations wouldn't take America seriously because they didn't know if treaties would be honored. The economy suffered because businesses couldn't predict which rules applied. The founders recognized that a functioning nation absolutely required a clear hierarchy of authority. But they also remembered their experience under British rule, where unlimited government power led to tyranny. So they created something brilliant: a hierarchy that grants federal supremacy but only within carefully defined constitutional boundaries. The Supremacy Clause represents the founders' elegant solution to this dual challenge. They needed federal supremacy strong enough to prevent the chaos of conflicting authorities, but limited enough to prevent federal tyranny. The result is what we're studying: a hierarchy that makes federal law supreme only when that federal law operates within constitutional boundaries. This only when authorized limitation is what transforms the Supremacy Clause from an unlimited grant of federal power into a carefully balanced system that protects liberty while enabling effective government. Understanding this historical context helps us see why every single word in the Supremacy Clause matters. The founders chose those words carefully, knowing they were creating the structural foundation for a new form of government, one that would be strong enough to function but limited enough to preserve freedom. Now let's connect the Supremacy Clause to perhaps the most famous Supreme Court case in American history, Marbury v. Madison from 1803. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion that established the principle of judicial review, the power of courts to declare laws unconstitutional. But here's what many people don't realize: Marshall's opinion in Marbury is directly connected to the Supremacy Clause's in pursuance thereof language. Marshall understood that the Supremacy Clause doesn't just create federal supremacy, it defines the boundaries of that supremacy. His opinion in Marbury explains why courts must examine whether laws comply with constitutional authority. Without this judicial review power, the in pursuance thereof limitation would be meaningless. Think about it: if courts can't examine whether federal laws exceed constitutional authority, then the Supremacy Clause's limitation has no enforcement mechanism. Marshall connected these dots brilliantly, creating the framework that protects constitutional boundaries to this day. Let me read you Chief Justice Marshall's complete analysis from Marbury v. Madison, because understanding both parts together is foundational to everything we're discussing. Marshall established two inseparable principles. First, a law repugnant to the Constitution is void. Second, and equally critical, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Here's what this means in practice: when a law violates the Constitution, it is void, meaning it has no legal effect. But, and this is crucial, courts determine which laws are unconstitutional, not individuals. You cannot simply declare a law void and refuse to comply. That's not how constitutional government works. This connects to the Supremacy Clause's in pursuance thereof language. Federal laws are supreme only when made in pursuance of the Constitution. When a law is not made in pursuance of constitutional authority, Marshall tells us it's void, but courts must make that determination through proper legal proceedings. The proper framework: when you believe government officials are claiming authority that exceeds constitutional limits, you must 1. Present your constitutional analysis to a court through proper legal channels. 2. Let judges evaluate whether the government action violates the Constitution. 3. Obtain a judicial ruling that the government action is unconstitutional. 4. Secure court-ordered remedies to enforce constitutional compliance. Understanding this complete principle, that unconstitutional acts are void and that courts determine constitutionality, empowers you to challenge government overreach through the legal system, not by individual defiance. This is legitimate constitutional advocacy. Now let's make the direct connection between Marshall's principle in Marbury and the Supremacy Clause. The phrase "in pursuance thereof" in Article Virgin Islands means that federal laws must comply with constitutional authority to claim supremacy. Marshall's declaration that unconstitutional laws are void explains what happens when this requirement isn't met. Here's how they work together. The Supremacy Clause establishes that federal laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are supreme. Marbury explains that laws not made in pursuance, meaning laws that exceed constitutional authority, are void. Together, these principles create a complete system. Federal supremacy exists within constitutional boundaries, and courts have the power to enforce those boundaries by declaring unconstitutional laws void. This isn't just abstract legal theory, this is the mechanism that protects your rights from government overreach. When you understand both the Supremacy Clause and Marbury together, you have the analytical framework to evaluate any government authority claim you encounter. Now we're going to learn a practical analytical framework that you can use to evaluate any government authority claim. This four-step framework derives directly from the constitutional principles we've been discussing, the Supremacy Clause and Marbury v. Madison. These four questions will become second nature to you as you develop constitutional competency. Professional legal analysts use variations of this same framework, but many never learned it systematically the way you're learning it now. By mastering this framework in week 1, you're building the foundation for sophisticated constitutional analysis that will serve you throughout this program and beyond. Let's go through each step carefully, because understanding this framework is crucial to developing genuine constitutional literacy. Step 1 is the foundational question: does the Constitution actually grant this power to the federal government? Notice we're not asking whether the power seems reasonable, or whether it serves a good purpose, or whether most people support it. We're asking a specific, verifiable question: did the Constitution grant this particular power to the federal government? This matters because the federal government is one of limited, enumerated powers. It doesn't have general police power, it only has the specific powers the Constitution grants it. If the Constitution doesn't grant a particular power to the federal government, then the federal government doesn't have that power, period. This is basic constitutional structure, but it's amazing how often government officials claim power that don't actually exist in the constitutional text. Your ability to ask this question, and then verify the answer using primary sources, is the first line of defense against government overreach. In Session B, you'll learn exactly how to research this question using the actual constitutional text and Supreme Court precedents. But first, you need to understand why this question matters and how it fits into the larger analytical framework. Step 2 recognizes that even when the Constitution grants federal authority, that authority isn't unlimited. Let me give you an example to show why this matters. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's clear federal authority. But does that mean Congress can regulate absolutely anything by claiming it somehow relates to interstate commerce? No. The commerce power has constitutional boundaries. The Supreme Court has explained that there are activities so far removed from interstate commerce that regulating them would exceed constitutional authority even though the commerce power exists. So Step 2 asks, is the federal government staying within the boundaries of its granted authority? This is where the "in pursuance thereof" language really matters. A law isn't made in pursuance of constitutional authority if it exceeds the boundaries of that authority, even if the general subject matter falls within federal power. This distinction is crucial. Government officials often claim that because they have some authority in an area, they have unlimited authority in that area. Step 2 prevents that overreach by requiring analysis of constitutional boundaries, not just general authorization. Step 3 deals with situations where state governments are exercising authority. Remember, states retain significant governing power under our constitutional system. The 10th Amendment confirms this: powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. So states have broad authority to govern within their borders. But Step 3 asks, does the state's exercise of authority conflict with valid federal constitutional authority? Notice that word valid, it's carrying a lot of weight. The state action only has to yield to federal authority that's actually constitutional. If the federal government is exceeding its constitutional authority, then there's no valid federal authority for the state action to conflict with. This is where many people get confused. They think the Supremacy Clause means federal law always wins over state law. But that's not what the Supremacy Clause says. It says federal laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are supreme. If the federal law isn't constitutional, it doesn't have supremacy, and state authority isn't subordinate to it. Step 3 requires you to first determine whether valid federal constitutional authority exists before concluding that state law must yield. Step 4 recognizes that even when government has constitutional authority to act, individual constitutional rights can limit or prevent that action. This is the ultimate boundary on government power, the protection of individual rights. Let me explain why this matters. Sometimes the government has clear constitutional authority to do something in general, but the specific way they're exercising that authority violates individual constitutional rights. For example, the government clearly has authority to enforce criminal laws. But they can't enforce those laws in ways that violate the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, or the Fifth Amendment's due process protections, or the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel. So step 4 asks, even if the government has authority for this general action, does the specific way they're exercising it violate constitutional rights? This step reminds us that constitutional analysis isn't just about whether government has power, it's also about whether government is respecting the rights that the Constitution protects. Together, these 4 steps create a comprehensive framework for analyzing any government authority claim you encounter. Master this framework, and you'll have analytical tools that exceed what most people, including many lawyers, possess. Now let's talk about why understanding this hierarchy matters for you personally. Constitutional boundary protection isn't just an abstract concept, it's a practical tool that empowers you to recognize when government claims exceed constitutional authority. Here's the reality: government officials often claim powers they don't actually possess. Sometimes they do this intentionally, knowing most people won't challenge questionable authority claims. Sometimes they do it unknowingly, because they themselves don't fully understand constitutional boundaries. But here's what matters for you. When you understand the constitutional hierarchy and how to analyze authority claims, you can recognize government overreach. You're not dependent on government officials to voluntarily limit themselves. You can identify when authority claims exceed constitutional boundaries. This knowledge is empowering because it transforms you from a passive subject of government power into an informed citizen who understands constitutional limits. You don't have to be a lawyer to develop this competency. You just need to understand the framework and learn how to use primary sources to verify claims, which is exactly what we're teaching you. Let me give you specific patterns to watch for. These are common ways that government authority claims exceed constitutional boundaries. First, watch for claims of federal power where no constitutional authorization exists. If the federal government is doing something and you can't find any constitutional provision authorizing it, that's a red flag. Second, watch for actions that exceed the boundaries of granted authority. Remember, having some authority doesn't mean having unlimited authority in that area. Third, watch for federal actions that conflict with constitutional rights. Even valid government authority must be exercised in ways that respect constitutional protections. Fourth, watch for violations of procedural protections. The Constitution requires certain processes, like due process, notice requirements, and opportunity to be heard. When government skips these procedures, they're exceeding constitutional authority regardless of whether they have general power in that area. Understanding these patterns helps you spot potential constitutional problems. We're not teaching you to be paranoid or to assume all government action is wrong. We're teaching you to be analytical and to recognize when specific government actions exceed constitutional boundaries. That's a crucial distinction. Here's an uncomfortable truth that you need to understand. Government officials frequently claim powers they don't actually possess. Sometimes these are innocent mistakes. The officials themselves may not fully understand constitutional boundaries. Sometimes they're based on outdated precedents or on lower court decisions that conflict with Supreme Court holdings. And sometimes, frankly, officials claim power knowing that most people won't have the knowledge or resources to challenge those claims effectively. But here's what matters. You now have the analytical framework to evaluate authority claims yourself. You don't have to just accept government assertions about their own power. You can ask the 4-step questions we just learned. You can research constitutional provisions and Supreme Court precedents using the verification methods you'll learn in Session B. You can distinguish between what officials claim they can do and what the Constitution actually authorizes them to do. This is the essence of constitutional literacy, the ability to independently evaluate authority claims rather than passively accepting them. And it's this competency that separates informed, empowered citizens from those who are merely subject to government power without understanding its constitutional limits. The beautiful thing about the hierarchy analysis framework you're learning is that it reveals governmental overreach systematically. You're not just guessing or relying on political opinions, you're using a structured analytical framework based on constitutional text and Supreme Court precedent. When you apply the 4-step framework, it reveals several types of problems systematically. First, it reveals unauthorized claims of power, where government claims authority that was never granted. Second, it reveals instances where government exceeds granted authority, where they have some power but are going beyond its constitutional boundaries. Third, it reveals violations of constitutional rights, where the specific method of exercising authority infringes protected rights. Fourth, it reveals procedural failures, where government isn't following constitutionally required processes. This framework is powerful because it's systematic, verifiable, and based on constitutional text rather than political preference. In the weeks ahead, you'll practice applying this framework to real scenarios. But right now, in week 1, we're focused on making sure you thoroughly understand the framework itself. You're building the foundation that everything else will rest on. Now we're going to do something most people never do. We're going to read Article by Clause 2 word by word, analyzing what each phrase means and why it matters. You've already seen parts of this in session of Part 1, but now we're going deeper. This detailed analysis will help you understand not just what the Supremacy Clause says, but why it says it that way, and how each phrase contributes to the constitutional structure. Professional constitutional lawyers do this kind of close textual analysis all the time. By learning to do it yourself in week 1, you're developing analytical skills that will serve you throughout this program. Let's start from the beginning and work through each phrase systematically. Pay close attention to the exact words used, they were chosen very carefully, and each one matters. The Supremacy Clause begins with this Constitution. This placement is absolutely crucial. The Constitution itself is listed first in the hierarchy. It comes before federal laws, before treaties, before state laws, before everything. Why does this matter? Because it establishes that the Constitution is the source and limit of all government authority in the United States. When we analyze any question of government power, we always start by asking, what does the Constitution itself say? Does it grant this power? Does it limit this power? Does it protect individual rights against this power? This Constitution reminds us that the document itself, not the preferences or opinions of government officials, controls. Government officials take oaths to support and defend the Constitution, not to support and defend their own authority claims or their agency's preferred policies. When you see this Constitution at the start of the Supremacy Clause, remember, everything that follows must conform to what the Constitution itself authorizes. The Constitution is supreme, and everything else is subordinate to it. This is the foundation of constitutional government, government under law rather than government by arbitrary will. Next comes laws of the United States. This phrase refers to federal statutes, laws that Congress has passed following the constitutional legislative process. But notice what this does not include. It doesn't include executive orders standing alone. It doesn't include agency regulations without statutory backing. It doesn't include policy declarations or enforcement guidance documents. Laws of the United States means actual statutes, properly enacted by Congress and signed by the President, or passed over a presidential veto. This distinction matters enormously when you're evaluating federal authority claims. Federal agencies often issue rules and regulations, and these may have the force of law if they're based on valid congressional authorization. But the regulation itself isn't a law of the United States in the Supremacy Clause sense, it's the underlying statute that is. So when a federal official claims authority based on an agency regulation, you should ask, what's the underlying statutory authority? Is the regulation actually authorized by that statute? Is the statute itself constitutional? This kind of analysis requires understanding what laws of the United States actually means in constitutional terms. The phrase "which shall be made" emphasizes that we're talking about laws that go through the proper legislative process. Federal laws must be made through the Article I constitutional process, passed by both the House and Senate, presented to the President, and either signed or passed over a veto. This isn't just a technicality, it's a fundamental protection. The legislative process includes deliberation, debate, voting, and public accountability. Laws that bypass this process, executive orders trying to create new legal obligations without statutory authority, agency rules not properly authorized by statute, informal policy changes that create new requirements, these don't qualify as laws made through the constitutional process. So which shall be made acts as a filter. It requires that federal laws claiming supremacy actually went through the constitutional lawmaking process. This protects against executive or administrative overreach, where officials try to create binding legal rules without going through Congress. Understanding this phrase helps you identify when federal action lacks proper constitutional foundation, even when it might serve good policy goals.